and welcome. You are listening to the Lama podcast. I'm Gunjan.
I'm Rajiv.
And we have our special guest tonight, Dr. Manpreet Sahuta. Dr. Manpreet and Rajiv, they've been really good friends. But Manpreet, before I give it to Rajiv, can we call you Man and do some Man Ki Baat with you? Because the topic that we have today is really close to my heart. We've all been on that boat. And over to you, Rajiv.
That oh shit moment happens when, you read some words that really, make you pause and think. So then I messaged her and said, phenomenal poetry. Then I found out that she is from a town where I grew up, Fagwada, somewhere around that, not that far off. And then we connected, we exchanged poems, we have talked about, many things. And recently I heard her research on this topic that we are going to discuss today. And I will let Manpreet introduce herself more and also the topic, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. Thank you so much, Gunjan. And thank you for inviting me to this podcast, first of all. And I say my hello to all your listeners. This is phenomenal work that you're doing.
Thank you.
And as for Man Ki Baat, Gunjan, you definitely don't want me to do that because once I start that, there would be no stopping. So, but yes, I value.
We can do a series on that.
Yeah,
we can do a series on that. And
yeah, Dalai Lama 2.0 or Drama Lama.
Yeah. And that phrase that particular phrase may be triggering for some. So I would rather not. But I totally get the connotation. This topic is close to my heart too, to anybody and everybody who has ever been away from their country of origin and they have tried to prove themselves. So on that note, I must thank Rajiv also. It's been wonderful connected to having been connected with you for that long. I did not even recall what poem it was, but thank you so much. I absolutely have forgotten which poem it was. And it's been wonderful reading your books and now listening to your podcast.
Thank you.
And as far as introduction is concerned, I am primarily a teacher. I teach in a college in Toronto. My area of research is immigrant experience and multicultural literature. I also host a radio show that is in Punjabi. And apart from that, I also have a humble podcast, which I call Chai Lunch.
Yes.
I have not been that prolific in posting as both of you have been. So hats off to you. I have been pretty slow in that.
That's fine. This is,
all in good time.
Yeah, exactly.
And I love to narrate stories. Storytelling is my forte, my business. So I have been also trying to keep a repository of stories from Punjabi literature and some selected Urdu literature, Hindi literature on another podcast. So 2 podcasts running, very moderate kind of a thing. I call that podcast Next Page.
Agla Varka.
Agla Varka. So thank you so much. And then I would leave it to you both to begin the conversation. Yeah.
Sure. So let's first, explain the term, the topic of your research, because the listeners, not everybody may have first-hand experience about immigrants and immigration. Mm-hmm. But now the concept, does it also apply to people who immigrate from, let's say, a small town like Fagwada, like I did, from there to Delhi or Bombay, or like, does it only apply to cross country, or is it?
Yeah, or is it like going cross state as well?
So we are focusing on the topic model minority narrative, or the model minority myth, or the model minority stereotype, call it by any name.
Okay.
So that is the concept, that is the lie essentially that we are going to discuss, because your podcast is about the lies that we tell ourselves, the world tells us, and the lies that we tell the world, and the lies that kind of keep the world going in a way. So this is one big fat lie that sometimes immigrants are told. The model minority narrative, or the stereotype, or a lie that they are fed. And as to whether that lie is told to almost every demography or every group of immigrants, yes, more or less, yes. In fact, you also, both of you have established in your previous episodes, I've been listening to the podcast, many lies keep us going. Many lies keep us, keep our world go from one place to the next. Many positive lies also. Sometimes we lie to our children also, to friends also, harmless kinds of lies. And we live with them and we accept them. This particular lie, the model minority narrative lie, it's a very interesting kind of syndrome or lie which you encounter. The definition of this lie is that you, as a minority immigrant group, or say a group which is not considered the mainstream, which it used to be considered the mainstream. Even the mainstream has now changed with the changing globalized world. So we won't touch on that. I won't make the argument very complex. But sometimes what happens is that a minority group, a minority immigrant group especially, they are told, you are the best, your family values are the best, you are successful because of these family values that you bring to this country. You're not facing any racism. This is how it is. And you have learned to keep your head low. You are brilliant in X, Y, or Z. And this is why you don't face any racism, right? That is the very basic form of these kind of narratives that are built around us. But it's a very interesting concept, which was actually born in 1966. I mean, officially, if I were to say so.
Like the term was born in 1966?
The term, yes, yeah.
Okay.
The model
because the
minority
thought
concept.
process may have been even earlier, right? So
always, it's always been around.
Yes.
Yeah. The thought process has always been around. If I were to go back to the colonial history of India, you would find that this narrative is swirling around us all the time. When one community is told, well, you have something better than the other community. So that has always been there. And that also should bring us to the fact as to who is peddling these lies, who is telling these lies, and to whom and why. But before we go into that, a very interesting article was published in 1966 on 9th of January, in fact, in America. And the article was written by a sociologist called William Peterson. The article was called Success Story, Japanese American Style. Now, if you know a little bit about the Japanese immigrants and their history in the US, and also in Canada, but I'll stick to US. The Japanese Americans were suddenly considered enemy aliens during the Second World War. Because America was on the opposite side of where Japan was fighting in the Second World War. Japanese immigration history in the US has been since the early 20th century, or even before that. And there always had been an anti-Asian sentiment in America. And it got escalated when the Second World War ignited. Right? So what happened was that the Japanese immigrants were suddenly labeled enemy aliens, and all their properties were attached, that is confiscated. Their businesses were sold for peanuts. Their cars were taken away. They were a rich community, especially in the western part. Their stuff was taken away, so they were practically reduced to being paupers. And things did not stop there. It was government sanctioned, and the government threw them into camps called the Japanese internment camps, where they were supposed to start their life from scratch. They could take only 2 or 3 suitcases with them to those campsites. And not only that, they also had to pay rent to live in those makeshift tents and those places. Long story short, they were pushed by the government to nothing, like they were reduced to nothing. And then Second World War finishes, and then the government eventually reinstates them. I don't know if the US eventually did apologize to the Japanese or not, but Canada did. And the Japanese were once again able to rebuild their lives because, now the war has ended and the world needs manpower. So many other factors are going on. The Japanese again pull themselves up by their bootstraps and they rebuild their lives, right? So 1945 is when the World War ends. 1966 is when this article is written, around 20 years later.
Almost, yeah.
So this article says, William Peterson in this article says, well, the Japanese Americans are so wonderful, so good. They have achieved their high socioeconomic status because of their hard work, because of their cultural values, because of their discipline, work ethic, and they adhere to social hierarchy. So he says, because you have all of these values, so Japanese Americans are the model minority to which we can look up to and say, this is how you realize that success.
And this is how the minority should behave.
So so it's a long article, very interesting article. I can send you a PDF. It's a very badly printed, but I can send it to you. Now, that is not the whole story. The article ends with a very short paragraph, which calls out the Black Americans and says, well, the Japanese were able to make it big in the US, even in the face of this adversity, and the Black community could not. And he ends his article over there. Right? So what he's doing is he's praising one community, the Japanese, for overcoming government-sanctioned apartheid, internments, discrimination, while criticizing another. And forgetting the part that the Blacks were not able to succeed where the Japanese were because the Blacks had a longer history of slavery and disadvantage as compared to the Japanese. And also you cannot compare apples with oranges.
Yeah.
Right?
So,
now
so one question,
that narrative went on. Yeah.
Yeah. So one question comes to my mind. That is American democracy a farce? Because is that a lie that we tell ourselves? If a democratic government can do what you explained, it did. How is it different from Idi Amin, who kicked all Indians out?
See, we also need to place all of these things in a particular context. The democracy that we encounter today is different from the democracy that we see in history. It has also evolved, and the things that were acceptable, say 40 years ago, are not considered acceptable now. Segregation, for example, was legal in the United States of America not too long ago. But today, if you were to ever attempt at segregating two communities, especially whites and Blacks, there would be a huge the government will be called out. Segregations are still there, but they've taken different shapes. But that's a conversation for another day. So, so we'll leave it at that for now. Yeah.
So so what was the effect of that article? So you mentioned that started it.
So in fact, what happened was that he did not use this term. The exact term he did not use. William Peterson did not use this, but this article kind of set into motion that narrative, that stereotyping, that idea, oh, well, the Asians, because they have that family structure, that social setup, this is why they succeed, right? So kind of explaining their success. And in the process, now what you're doing is you are letting the whole community know, the community that is being painted as a model minority, You are able to do it because of these things. Therefore, you must maintain that structure. Therefore, you must maintain that family hierarchy and all those things. And that is how things go. And you probably would have seen, even within our community, all the same factors are more or less adhered to in the immigrant communities. If you have observed around yourselves, things are, of course, changing, but this
Yeah.
narrative does stay, somewhere at the back of our minds, and we keep telling ourselves, oh, we always would succeed because of da 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 da.
So this, yeah, Gunjan, you're
Yeah,
going to say
this was
something?
a trap that was laid in 1960s, and we are still somehow, I don't know how we are getting into it, and why, how do we come out of this trap?
Yeah, before we talk about how do we come out of this trap, it's very important to see what does it look like.
Yes,
You know,
because as I was as we were speaking, I am reflecting back. I belong to high tech community. So when I immigrated, and I've been around for like 20, 30 years around here, and I see a very typical kind of same mentality and same narrative in corporate cultures.
How so?
So for example, Indians are very smart, so they're very hardworking.
Yeah.
And and this was something I'll tell you my own experience. I was with Intel for like 20 years, and I was growing my organization in Asia. And the narrative was exactly that, hey, these guys, they will work like anything, dedicated. You look, for the future of Intel and all that, the BS that was being fed. What was happening was that I noticed that some of my team members, especially in Asia, Malaysia, India, and even China, they would not hesitate. They would not refuse a meeting, even if it was at 1 a.m. at night. And I would tell them, guys, would your counterpart in the US accept a meeting at 1 a.m. at night? And there's no, Rajiv, all my stakeholders are in US. I said, no, forget about that. We all are one company like Intel.
Yeah.
Everybody has to share the pain. So I brought in the concept of share the pain. You take a meeting at night, then your counterpart in the US should be expected to take a meeting at night. So that narrative, kind of like you are saying, change the behavior, because everybody was trying to fit into that.
Yeah.
Because then they say that if I am doing this, I will be successful.
Yeah. It's for the survival.
Yes.
Right?
And competition, obviously. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right? Survival, competition, and then this pressure of, oh, they will do anything at any time. And so they obviously, as Gunjan's question, how do we get out of it? What does it look like, and what does it do to us?
Yes.
You just mentioned, what toll would that take on your mental health if you were to have no boundary between, your professional and your personal space?
Yes.
And when you're doing something like that, something like, doing, okay, I can take the call anytime, you are essentially pitching yourself for a burnout eventually.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So even if it's a positive bias or a positive lie, it is still a lie.
Yes, right? Exactly. So how do we recognize it? So
how do we recognize it? First things first, you are presented as a group which is uniformly successful in areas like education or employment or income or your social mobility. So that there's a perception of success which is built and which is measured by those markers of economic prosperity. The Indians and the Pakistanis would have the biggest houses in the locality. Right? Or that they would have the biggest cars, the most swanky lifestyle, right? So that marker, essentially, what does it do? It takes away the focus, takes the focus away from people who are not in that bracket
Mm,
and whose idea of success is different, but who
mm,
may be as successful. Or the people who don't have those markers of success and are poor, essentially. They may be
mm,
Indian, Pakistani, or any minority in these countries and be poor. They may not be able to present themselves as that successful, that rich, group of people. I mean, we've
mm,
heard that expression, "crazy rich Asians."
mm. Yes.
Right, and also in our colleges and schools we've had that narrative which told us that Asian students, especially from China, about 10 years ago we used to hear this. They come to Canada and they are spoiled, or that they are so rich but they will succeed. So you see the narrative. On one hand,
Mm,
you will pitch them against the immigrants from China who are here, and they'll say, oh, well,
mm,
they keep their head down, their kids are very hardworking, they'll do anything, etc., etc. Right? Then you also
mm,
see the Filipino community. So many of their people, especially women, are
mm.
employed in healthcare and in caregiving industries. Right? What does it do to them, their children? I mean, many of them can share their stories of having left their children in the Philippines for a long time, and they can't even go back until they've had some capital that they may
Yeah.
be able to invest back home. So and they're usually pitched as that model minority which will not complain and who can be hired for less. So there's that flip side to success. And what I'm trying to say is that sometimes the community is considered as a monolith,
Yes.
as that one big group.
Yeah.
And the difference is in the ethnicity in that subgroup. They are ignored because
Mm.
the people who are telling you this stereotype or that narrative don't know that. Right? So that is like one broad brush that is.
No, that's a very interesting thing that you've mentioned, especially around Philippines and all that. Because if I reflect back, I'm from Punjab, and we used to have a lot of people from Bihar, as workers,
Yeah.
either in the farms or factories. My dad had a business around, we had factories and trading and all that. And if I reflect back, the same kind of narrative was being built there, that these people come in, they're hard workers, they keep their head down, and who did that were more successful than the others.
Yeah.
And we
Yeah,
see the
and
same game being played at international, immigration level and migration level.
True.
Interesting.
True. Gunjan, you were saying something.
Yes, so here's my observation when people say Indians, Asians, rich people, intelligent people. That's the basic criteria. If you have ever filled those forms, they want to know you have enough property which will bring you back to your country. So that's the basic criteria. When only that percentage is getting selected and you are seeing only intelligent people and rich people, and if you're forming that narrative, then I really don't know how to correct that. That's one part of it. And another is sunk cost fallacy. We spend so much of money on college that we want to repay that amount. If we have spent money in USD for college, and I want to pay back that amount in USD, and by the time I get so used to with the culture, convenience, whatever you want to call it. And I was telling Rajiv before you joined that when my first visit to US, and I was in Calcutta at that time, 24 hours water, 24 hours electricity, and no mosquitoes. It was like heaven for me. And we know how much we have worked hard for filling the forms and completing the paperwork, everything, this sheet, that sheet, blood group, organ health, everything was like.
Even today.
Yes.
Yeah,
Even
the reason you are in India, because a lot of your paperwork is stuck in the US.
so. Yes, I mean, there's a lot of hard work that is done. That's where you reach US or Canada or Australia, any developed country. So when the criteria is so they talk about inclusion so much. Have they ever picked anyone from the slum and taken there? And I used to work for an NGO for abandoned kids, and they used to specifically look for kids, for brown kids, just assuming that they're very intelligent.
Yeah, yeah.
Assumption was they are very intelligent. They don't know what
Assumptions.
gone through pregnancy and how it has impacted the kid. But the assumption was that no, Indian kids are very intelligent and we want to adopt a kid from India.
Yeah,
Now the adoption policies have gone very strict here. But yes, that was the narrative that yes, we want an Indian kid and we want to adopt an Indian kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And add on to the fact, the family values, when you mention that they want the kid from a particular genetic pool, add on to that family values, thinking, oh, you know what, their filial piety is there, they will always obey their parents, and that they will have those ideals kind of ingrained in them. And that narrative again plays into that privileged class that we are talking about. When Rajiv mentioned the migrants from migrants from Bihar coming into Punjab to find employment, who was the one building that narrative? The privileged class was the one building that narrative because it suited them.
Yes.
And then the class that is being fed that narrative is the class which will work extra hard to live up to those standards, to live up to that narrative that has been now built. Look at this. I mean, there's this whole structure that has been built on that assumption, stereotype, narrative, story, which is being created by somebody else, peddled by somebody else, and then is being lived by a whole different class. That is exactly what happens.
So now the thing is that, is there a way that we can avoid it? Or let's say, I wouldn't say avoid, because, we also, for example, when I came in, I remember, I worked my butt off to be where I am. And, although it's not part of this discussion, but, maybe in a separate episode, we can talk about, if I had worked as hard as it did in the US, back in India, would I have been achieving the same or maybe more success or less success? Maybe that's a different topic of research and discussion we can do. But the question is that, was I working hard because of the narrative, and that was being fed, and I wanted to demonstrate that, yes, I am, part of that, quote unquote, selected, the privileged, immigrant, versus did I work hard and did I, just do what I wanted to do because of the opportunity? So this is something that we can discuss. And what does your research say around why this happens and what can we do to actually be aware of it? I'm not saying that we will ever get rid of it.
Yeah. See, when you say you work extra hard to live up to those expectations, and our listeners may be thinking, it's a good thing, isn't it? If something is pushing you to work extra hard, to earn extra money, to make a great position, and to have somebody else think really high of you, isn't that a great thing? On the face of it, yes. That would push you, that would inspire you, that would make you feel
to be better than what you are today.
Right? As you said, would I have been successful in another place? Perhaps, perhaps not. There is also that comfort level. There is also the complacency that comes with within staying in your home turf. And those are, as you said, a conversation for another day. But here's the thing. When you are fed this kind of narrative, yes, you may feel pushed to do the best that you can, and you should be. And that should not actually be subject to any of these stories that somebody else tells you. That should be innate, that should be coming from within, or the external motivation also. This is, as the podcast mandate is, a lie, which helps people to ignore discrimination. I'll tell you something very interesting. In my radio shows, sometimes when I open lines for listeners to contribute and talk about racism, as to how you have encountered racism, how you processed it, what did you do about it? It's a very serious conversation. 95% listeners, when they call in, especially men,
I must say. They'll school me and they'll say there is no racism that we as brown people face. If there is any racism, we should not really mind it, because as people of privilege back home, as Gunjan was saying, there's a particular class that always migrates because they have the privilege and the means to migrate when it comes to international immigration. So they tell me that because we have been the so-called privileged class and we have done this discrimination towards others, therefore we should not really mind if this discrimination is thrown at us. Number
So
one.
we are paying for our sins.
Yeah.
Number one. And I always ask this question, the exact same question. Does that mean that 2 negatives would make 1 positive? No, they won't. Not in this case, right? Just because you have been at the giving end of this discrimination does not justify the fact that you, as well as people like you, will suffer this. It's not okay.
Yeah.
Second thing is that we often internalize racism. When these kind of narratives are pushed on us, we internalize that racism, we absorb that racism, we start to believe that this is what is happening. And we tend to then live with it.
So
right?
now, because one of the, one of the observation I've had, and actually in high tech, I don't know if you have heard this term, but in the US, it's very prevalent, called coconuts. Have you heard about this?
Yeah.
Yeah. So brown from the outside and white from the inside. So because this term actually initiated when the Indians, they observed that there is a lot of discrimination by Indians against Indians.
Great.
So does that play into the same thing that you're talking about? Is that what is surfacing it?
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned it. I would have forgotten this point. So the other thing that I get schooled on is when I talk about caste-based discrimination in the Western world. Not India. I'm not talking about that because that's a different, again, a huge conversation which we can have on different forums. But in US, Canada, Britain, even Australia, caste-based discrimination against our own people. And I get schooled on this. How? When I ask them, how does caste play when you interact with people of South Asian origin here in Canada? Some of them will come and say in exact same tone, why are we talking about caste in this part of the world? The Gora doesn't know any caste. Why are we educating them about caste? That way they will then discriminate against us on the basis of caste. And I'm like, hell yeah, the Gora doesn't know the caste, but you know.
Yes.
And you should also look at who is heading departments and who is the supervisor in different departments, and how do they engage in this caste-based discrimination against their own people who are working on their teams. So it's not that they are doing it to you, you are doing it to your own people. This is the reason why Seattle in the US had to be the first city to include it in their charter to say no caste-based discrimination, right? Toronto School Board had to do this and say there is caste-based discrimination. We will not allow that on our campuses. Rajiv.
Now, so actually, I was, the reason I interjected, have you read about or heard about the case that happened in Cisco? At Cisco? Yes. So, and for the listeners, this was a very interesting case that happened around 3 years ago. They found out some whistleblower, obviously, somebody complained that some Indian, there was a very clear nexus between some managers who were from a certain community. And, they had a very clear understanding that they will not hire anybody outside of that community. So at Cisco, the HR, obviously, it was a complete team, that was working against, this. So when somebody raised it, and that actually became a very big thing, that led to what Manpreet is saying, in Seattle, because Seattle is the new high tech, I would say, ghetto that
yeah.
beyond Silicon Valley.
Yeah. So again, going back to what Gunjan also said, these two things tie up very closely. They're very, very closely tied. The privileged class would then create those rules, which would implicitly or explicitly discriminate against a group of people. So where does that concept of model minority now go? Right? So we have believed in that model minority narrative. Then there is the caste-based discrimination. Then there is the privilege. And we have believed that we don't do that. Look at the nexus that now we have built, and we have kind of literally put ourselves in that trap that you mentioned, Gunjan.
There's one state base as well, like, particular state, particular people, and they'll have a very close-knit nexus. And we have experienced that. I was in a very small town called Peoria, and there was a event that was supposed to happen in Temple. It was Telugu Association of Peoria. We were so handful Indians. On that also, we had a Telugu Association of Peoria. And I said that my son is in vocal and he would like to sing a song. They said, no, it was Humko Man Ki Shakti Dena. It's a Bollywood number, but beautiful one. Like, it can be sung in the temple. And they said, no, either it has to be in Sanskrit or Telugu. And I said, you are having a fashion show. Can you please tell me in what language you are having it? Because I was a non-Telugu, we were like cut off that, okay, your son cannot perform here. And the temple was for everyone. I was like, okay, that's a lost battle. I don't even want to fight it. It's okay. It's okay.
In that whole story of the model minority stereotype that we buy into, heritage, exclusivity,
right,
and a glory in the past, that is also those ingredients which you can throw in that model minority narrative to tell yourself we are the best. And it's a great thing. You know what? Having that feeling is a great thing. But when it comes to segregating just the way Gunjan's son was segregated, that is where the whole story falls flat.
Yeah.
And then you're like, okay, so you mentioned the word ghetto, Rajiv. Then it becomes a ghetto within a ghetto within a ghetto.
Yes.
And on the face of it, we have, in Hindi, we'd say pocha mara hua hai humne usko.
Yes.
I know it was very Punjabi accent that I used.
Yeah. But it is. Yeah.
We've covered it nicely,
Very, very nicely. Icing on the cake kind of a thing, right? So it hides all the uneven surfaces and the things behind under it.
And it adds a different level of pressure on our young people, on our women, on everybody. The patriarchal setup, the hypermasculinity, that also, if you notice within our immigrant communities also, we may think that we have come far from home and that we are moving about in a society which does not really give a big impetus to these things. But when it comes to the model minority thing, these concepts also come back into play. And then it's like going back in time sometimes. You may have observed that immigrant communities tend to do that. All in the cover of, we are the best, we've worked really hard, we have succeeded because of A, B, C, D, because of family values, hierarchy, all those things that I mentioned early on, so I won't repeat. So in your research, at the process.
Yeah. So in your research, did you also study I remember I listened to your lecture on that. Really, really fascinating. And so now in your research, do you see some of the minorities drinking the Kool-Aid much more than the others?
I don't think I'd be able to separate different communities, because my focus in that presentation was primarily South Asian community. And I tried to look at some Canadian statistics to understand basically, are we talking about poverty? Are we talking about crime? Are we talking about the so-called family values that we think are really helping us to be successful? And what I found was counterintuitive to what we are being fed. So when you look at the Statistics Canada data from 2021, you find that people who are labeled as racialized communities are often poorer as compared to whiter communities. So where does that leave us as far as the model minority narrative is concerned? Does that mean that the average of the so-called prosperous versus non-prosperous has kind of evened out? I don't know. Then I tried to look at the crime rates in different parts where South Asian community is centered. And when you look at the narrative of family values and the strictness of the parents and all those things that we think, or we have been told that this is what model minority is, and versus when you look at the car thefts that are happening and the participation of South Asian youth, or the drug nexus, or so many other things that are happening, and the placement of our people, I'm like, what happened to the family values, people?
Yes.
Why aren't the
Yeah.
kids disciplined enough? What is happening? So either that narrative is, it's wrong, and we need to now reconsider and think, okay, this is not what the truth was, or something
Yes.
else is going on. If we are the model, then the model has shifted.
Then-
Something is happening.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Manpreet,
Yeah.
as a first,
Yes.
yeah,
sir.
yeah, as a first generation in the US, our only option was to work hard, keep up to the pace, stay ahead of time, because there are so many things like LCA, visa, there's so many project, job. If you do not have a job, if you do not have a project, you cannot
Yeah.
stay for more than a week.
Mm.
You will pack and go back to your country.
Mm.
So there is no other option than to just work hard and stay ahead of time and just complete everything, because then you'll be sent back. So if you're a low performer, please go back to your country.
But I think, the way when Manpreet was explaining, some of these things, I think even these immigration laws and everything, they ride on the same narrative. So it's like, I can now start, this is giving me a lot of, I would say, fodder for thought, that how we are blinded to things that have such a large impact on our long-term, I would say, mental health, happiness, well-being, and how we bring up our children. Because up here, like the concept of tiger mom, right? Manpreet,
Yeah.
you know that, right? So now it has become like something to look up to.
Yeah.
To become. So why that narrative there? Yeah, and then
the ideal shifts, right? The ideal
yes.
shifts, and that is exactly what we mean when we say we copy others. We tend to feel that is the ideal of success. As you mentioned, the tiger mom or the hardworking father, as Gunjan mentioned, right? And Gunjan, I remember the very first episode where you mentioned that you had to stay at home, and how that worked for you, because there was this narrative that, fathers work and mothers don't.
Yes.
And so in a model minority, again, there would be an added pressure on men if you were to look at the whole situation from a flip side. We are adding undue, unhealthy pressure on men while not allowing women to contribute, or throwing women into that feminine field of child rearing and nurturing and all that, even if a woman is not programmed to do that. So again, another lie. But you mentioned hard work, Gunjan. Hard work there's no alternative to hard work. Model minority narrative is not trying to call out hard work. I mean, if we are calling out model minority narrative, we are not trying to call out hard work. We are not trying to say hard work doesn't pay, or that you should not work hard. You should. And I think it would be criminal to think that somebody has a potential and it's not being realized, or they are not being allowed to realize it. It would be hugely criminal. But what we don't need is, and that would bring me to the question that Gunjan had, and you also kind of nudged me towards, how do we get rid of it eventually? If it's so harmful, if it's not working for us, why are we still in it, and we are still living this kind of lie, and how do we get out of it? We are living this lie because it suits us, because it suits another side, for whom it totally, it works.
It's a win-win situation.
It's a win-win for them more than for
Yeah.
us,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, if I look at the number of international students coming from India, the number is exponentially high. The number is disproportionately high. Why? Because it works. Because they've seen the community work and they know that this is how the community will eventually behave in this country, right? And that they have enough capital to bring into the country to invest it. So it's not that they are being kind to my Punjabi kids who are coming to Canada and taking admissions in these colleges while spending so much money. I often have those conversations with those students and say, I mean, there's no other way to say this except in Punjabi. So sorry.
Yeah,
but
sure,
I
yeah,
say,
I know.
ਤੁਸੀਂ ਬੋਰੇ ਭਰ ਕੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਨੋਟ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਹੋ. Make something of yourself. Use people who really want to work with you. But that's not a part of this.
I think we will. I definitely want to maybe in the next episode want to talk about this. Because this was something that I think we also exchanged over message that think about how much money. From rupees to dollars is being, the sack full of money that you said that, we give them sack full of money. If we use the same sack full of money and work the same way and with the same caliber, would we not have achieved the same results or better? But we'll talk about this in this different episode.
Yeah.
Getting back to what you were saying.
Yeah, we are buying into this because it suits us temporarily, not realizing that it is damaging us in the long run. It is damaging our kids in the long run, right? You know what? American author Emmy Tan, not sure if you've read her or not. Emmy Tan is of Chinese origin. Amazing storyteller. I think I've read pretty much everything that she's written, and I've used some of her readings in my classes. She says that as a child living in California, she was encouraged by her teachers to go for accounting and maths. She was not good at it. She wanted to write, she wanted to read, she wanted to engage with words. And her teachers, English teachers, would discourage her and tell her, you won't be able to write.
Because of model minority.
She is that narrative,
Yes.
That, the kids of Chinese origin are good with their accounting, etc. But she's an award-winning author, right? So imagine the damage it would have done to a potential if that model minority narrative had been bought and used by Emmy herself.
I am actually thinking of the current generation, and if listeners or whoever is listening to this podcast, think about the damage that we may be doing to our children by forcing them into the same model minority framework.
Yeah, professions.
How many writers? How many writers are we nipping in bud? How many musicians? How many artists?
Painters.
Just because, hey, science and medical, all that BS that we are taught.
Yeah, and just forcing them to be good kids. That's another trap. So the reason all of this happens is because there is a power imbalance. There is a privilege that is more powerful than a community, a segment, a people who do not have the vocabulary or the thoughts or the ideas to project their own story. Right? If I'm so one day my office secretary said, oh, you know what? You look like you're the ideal daughter-in-law. I'm like, no, I'm not falling into that trap. I'm not falling into that trap. My mother-in-law loves me. I love her. I'm not the ideal daughter-in-law. No. So that is your first step into that model minority.
Yes. So you recognize and you refuse to play by the rules.
Yeah. So I also quoted Chimamanda Adichie, who is my favorite author, in my talk that I shared with you, and based on which you decided, okay, let's talk about that. Chimamanda Adichie is a Nigerian author. There's an amazing TED talk by her and I would not advise, I would recommend our listeners to go Google her, Chimamanda Adichie, Danger of a Single Story. Danger of a Single Story is an amazing, amazing TED Talk, 19 minutes, best 19 minutes that you will invest in understanding how these stories are built and how we can wiggle out of them. In that, and I would not repeat everything that there is in that story, because we want to talk about how to get out of this model minority narrative. It's relevant to that. She questions some perspectives, some angles about those stories that are told. She says that since time immemorial, especially for the purpose of colonization in more recent times, single stories have been told about a group of people. Single story means one side is telling the story without going into the truth of that story and without involving the other side in telling of that story. Go back to William Peterson, who said, success story, Japanese style.
Yeah.
While not really talking about the hardships that they are facing or the family structure that may have developed some cracks, and still people are successful, or that there may be poor Japanese people, people of Japanese origin in America who may be struggling. So monolith, all those things that I talked about earlier. Single story is exactly that. So she says, when you build somebody's identity by telling, listening, and perpetuating a single story, you are essentially leading people to believe incomplete assumptions, and then you make them do or reach inaccurate decisions. So when we stop listening to those single stories, when we stop believing in those single stories or peddling those single stories, this narrative can be arrested right at that point. She attributes this to power. She says, if one side believes, says, or thinks that they are better than the other side, they can say that I know more about you than you do about yourself, or that I know why you're successful. And then because it suits you, you keep on buying into that narrative. She says that is how those stories are cycled and recycled and perpetuated. And that works for your political structures, that works for your economic structures, that works for your personal, even families that do that, right? So that model, when you force somebody to become so good just to live up to that expectation, essentially you are setting them for failure.
Yeah.
Pause and you reflect, you were like, oh my God, my life was such a waste. I could have done so many different things in so many different manners. But and now things have really changed. Back home in India, it's a golden period. You come to Bangalore, it's a hub of startups. And it is happening because people are here and they are investing and they are getting investors. And people are successful, from startup to unicorn to a good companies. They are making their lives and they are giving employment. Employment is there in their own country. So I mean, things have changed, they are changing, and I'm super proud of it that what we were 70 years ago and now where we are. And yes, people, when you tell them that going to US and all, this young generation says, when you interview them, where do you see yourself 5 years later? That question is still there. And they say, yeah, I want to have a startup of my own. And they have the ideas, and amazing, like it's not like there are not other startups doing the same work, but then again, how you execute that idea. So
I think that the the narrative still needs to be has to be like told, because I'm sure a lot of people still fall into the trap. And whoever is listening to the podcast, I think some very, very good things that Manpreet you shared, which I think should give pause and reflect to many people who are aspiring or trying to to go to a foreign country. be aware of it. I'm not saying that it's
Yeah.
good or bad.
It's a
My,
different
my only
experience
point has
altogether.
always, yes, my only point has been that we will do what we need to do. The only thing is we should be aware of why we are doing it, so that we are aware of the exit. You know, when we want to not fall into the narrative and we want to exit that narrative, it should not create such a mental or cognitive imbalance in ourselves that, you know, it impacts our mental health.
Yeah. And also, I think we can safely say that sometimes you may be able to use these to your advantage also,
Yes,
right?
yes,
So as we
yes.
said, this stems from that need to survive, that desire to make it big in the country. Very true. But at the same time, know who is saying what about you and why they are saying that, especially as a huge community. We are not talking about only individuals right here, but yes,
Yeah,
individuals
yeah.
would suffer because of this collective narrative that is built around a group of people. So
Yeah.
that critical thinking is what will help us exit from this kind
Yes.
of false story that may have been built around us or people of our community, say 100 years ago or 120 years ago.
Yeah.
That excessive stress on the past glory, that also would need to be examined in this light as to who built that narrative of past glory, and then who sought to benefit from that story, and why is that being peddled even today. So if we were to expand the scope of this model minority thing, it's definitely applicable to the immigrant communities, but also to people everywhere.
Yeah. Good. I think, you know, this is much broader and deeper discussion. So we will definitely bring you back, Manpreet. You know,
Absolutely.
you're given a lot of, you know, I think
Thought-provoking.
food for thought, at least to
Yes.
me. A
It's
lot
been
of things
lovely
are,
talking
a
with
lot
you
of,
both.
yeah. But so let's wrap up. And so Gunjan.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. Do log into our website, thelielama.com, THELIELLAMA.com. I know there is a punishment for Dr. Sahuta from Ranchi for our
Yeah, I
closing
know.
couplets, and Dr. Manpreet,
Yeah,
over
so-
to you.
Yeah, so for the listeners, you know, I had requested, you know, you know that I write in Punjabi and Hindi, but mostly in Hindi. But I had tried, you know, to write something in Punjabi, and when I wrote that blog, and the first person that came to my mind that was Manpreet. That I messaged her, "Hey Manpreet, can you help me fix my Punjabi, you know, poem?" And she forgot. Imagine, you know, and being a teacher, you know, so I said, "Okay, Manpreet, this is a punishment for you." So now,
From years ago.
yeah, from years ago, for, you know,
Now
missing your
principal plus
assignment. You know,
interest.
usually, you know, she gives the punishment to the children for, you know, or her students to miss the assignment. This is, so,
You've turned
so
it
she,
into.
you know, I requested her to recite my corrected poem.
Oh, this
Yeah.
was a request. I thought it was a punishment. Okay, go ahead.
He's sugarcoating it.
I know, exactly.
All right. So this was a poem by Rajiv. Beautiful poem. And again, introspection. You could apply it to today's conversation also, or to frankly any conversation. That is what a good poem should do. And I will recite it. And thank you for this reminder. I must apologize that I did forget. I tend to do that
No, I'm
sometimes. I
just kidding.
bite
I
more
was
than I
pulling
can
your
chew.
leg.
That was one of those times and days. But it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to narrate it for you, for our listeners, for everybody. And this poem is like this. ਇਸ ਰੂਹ ਦੀ ਦਹਿਕ ਦੀ ਅੱਗ ਨੂੰ ਕੋਈ ਕਦੇ ਨਾ ਸੇਕਣ ਆਇਆ। ਇਸ ਰੂਹ ਦੀ ਦਹਿਕ ਦੀ ਅੱਗ ਨੂੰ ਕੋਈ ਕਦੇ ਨਾ ਸੇਕਣ ਆਇਆ। ਹੰਝੂਆਂ ਦੀ ਬਾਰਿਸ਼ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਸ਼ਤੀ ਨਾ ਕਾਗਜ਼ ਕਿਸੇ ਤਰਾਇਆ। ਜਜ਼ਬਾਤ ਦੇ ਡੂੰਘੇ ਸਮੁੰਦਰ ਅੰਦਰ ਕਦੇ ਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਤਾਰੂ ਆਇਆ। ਮਨ ਦੇ ਪਿੱਪਲ ਹੇਠਾਂ ਨਾ ਪਸ਼ੂ ਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਬੋਧੀ ਆਇਆ। ਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਆਸ਼ਕ ਨਾ ਰਕੀਬ, ਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਆਸ਼ਕ ਨਾ ਰਕੀਬ, ਜਿੰਦ ਮੇਰੀਏ ਦੱਸ ਤੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਕੀ ਖੱਟਿਆ ਤੇ ਕੀ ਕਮਾਇਆ ਮੈਂ ਕੀ ਖੱਟਿਆ ਤੇ ਕੀ ਕਮਾਇਆ Thank you for this
That was so
opportunity.
wonderful. That was so wonderful.
Such wonderful
You
points
put
and
the
such
life in that
wonderful-
poem. Yes.
Yes.
No, thank you so
Couldn't
much
agree more.
for this reminder, this opportunity, and it's amazing the work that you're doing in this podcast. I think I have listened to almost every episode, barring one probably, the last one.
Thank you.
Great insights. Your guests are doing great job. The one conversation with Madam Nanda was also something
Yes.
of an eye-opener. Amazing. I was actually wondering how Rajiv was able to balance, but then I think you did a great job. So keep up the good work.
Thank you.
I look
Thank
forward
you.
to more conversations with you, and
Yes.
God willing, we will have conversations on my podcast too. So I would be inviting you both.
Yes.
Consider
Yes.
this an open invitation. Whenever we are ready, we will
Yes.
have that conversation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much.